Okay, Bill, we are live right now. Um, Welcome to the second episode of the Cookie Button Show, and I've had the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Bill Mulligan with me on the second episode, and we'll be speaking about Cilium. And he's from Isovalent himself. So, without further ado, I'll just let him introduce himself and tell us about his role as a Cilium open source project committer. Please go ahead, Bill.
Hi, so I'm Bill Mulligan. Thanks for the introduction. And as was said, I work at Isovalent, and I'm working on growing both the Cilium and eBPF communities. And that encompasses a lot of different things because in any open source project, there's lots of different roles to do, especially ones that don't have to do with code too. So everything to make the project more successful and help it grow.
All right. So, Bill, what inspired you to get involved with the Cilium project and how did you first get started?
Yeah, so I've been in the cloud native space for about 5 years now, and I've seen kind of like a lot of different projects. And originally, Cilium was one of the multiple CNIs that were kind of like, I wouldn't say competing, but different ones that people were kind of using. So I'd heard about Cilium for quite a while. And then in my previous role at the CNCF, I was actually working in the kind of like the telecommunication space a little bit, and I ran into the founders of Isovalent to try to get them involved in the telecommunication side of things. And that's kind of when I heard about Cilium again. And then when I was looking for a new role, I thought Isovalent was one of the really interesting companies because they're one of the creators and maintainers of eBPF, and it's, I guess, a really exciting technology right now. So when I started looking for other jobs again, I definitely looked into Isovalent. And luckily I applied and I got in. And there has been like a lot of opportunity since then. And at Isovalent, I'm kind of tasked with like working on building and growing the communities. And through that work, I kind of progressed through the ranks of the project and became one of the committers of the Cilium project.
Awesome. So, what do you think are one of the most, useful benefits of using Cilium for their network and security management in modern cloud environments?
Yeah, so I guess cloud native environments are a lot different than how things were originally designed for. When we first kind of like started running pieces of software, we had like hardware boxes, like people would name all their servers, and you'd know when something got unplugged. As we moved into more dynamic cloud environments, things were changing a lot quicker. Things were kind of like working at a much different scale. And that's kind of where we came up with the term cloud native, something that's born in the cloud and takes advantage of kind of like this new paradigm. And that's all great, but it presents kind of a lot of new challenges when things are changing very quickly, when things are working at a different scale, then it presents new challenges. And so to kind of help overcome some of those challenges is what Cilium and eBPF were born out of. So kind of eBPF is the underlying technology that allows us to customize the functionality of the Linux kernel. And Cilium leverages eBPF to provide cloud native ways of doing connectivity, observability, and security to kind of deal with these challenges of the new cloud native paradigm.
Right. So, what do you think are the challenges or the limitations that you have faced while working on the Cilium project, and how did you overcome them?
Oof, there's, I think in every open source project, a lot of different challenges that each project will face. The biggest one that I'm working on right now is actually graduation from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. So within the CNCF, there's three different levels. There's sandbox, incubating, and graduation. And right now we're an incubation project and we've applied to go for graduation. And kind of that process, there's a lot of things going on kind of behind the scenes to get the project ready in terms of making sure kind of like all of our documentation is in order. We've gone through a security review to make sure that our code is secure. We have a good governance process in place and that it's documented so that people know how to get involved in the project. And kind of working through kind of all of those in an open source community where you want everybody to kind of be on board, and it's not kind of a command and control structure, but it's a kind of driven through consensus, has been yeah, a really, I guess, challenging but also like kind of fun project. And I've learned a lot about how kind of open source works and how to kind of like lead things through influence.
So, how do you then see the future of Cilium and its role in the broader Kubernetes and cloud native ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are going to be like using Cilium as this kind of like unified connectivity layer. Um, I don't think we kind of, as an industry, have a term for kind of the space that Cilium is taking over, but broadly, it's how do we connect, observe, and secure things in the cloud native world. So this actually encompasses kind of like a lot of different things, and you can see it in the different ways that like the Cilium project is moving. And I'll kind of like walk through some of them right now. So the first one is kind of like on the networking side. Cilium originally began as a CNI as a way to provide like pod-to-pod connectivity within Kubernetes clusters. Beyond that, as people started spinning up like multiple clusters, it's the question, how do we connect multiple clusters together? So all of a sudden, Cilium's doing multi-cluster connectivity. Now, that's all kind of like layer three and layer four, but now there's kind of this new concept or this concept called service mesh that's more about like layer seven. How do we, what happens when we want to connect something, do retries, do like MTLS, those type of things. And Cilium Service Mesh was launched to kind of address and provide a full story from layer three to layer seven. And then kind of like going down from there, also being able to provide load balancing into clusters, load balancing within clusters, working on Gateway API, and then also being able to connect to external workloads through things like egress gateway. So kind of all of this is kind of this unified platform to connect, secure, and observe things in the cloud native world. Sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted to know, since you mentioned service mesh, which is kind of like a hot topic these days, people discussing. So how does Cilium address challenges around the network security area, such as micro-segmentation, zero trust, and service mesh integration?
Yeah, so kind of at the end of 2022, the Cilium Service Mesh was launched as kind of like a beta project to see like how that would work. And Service Mesh has kind of become this nebulous term that sometimes means nothing, sometimes means too much, but it's kind of trying to capture under one roof these things like you were talking about, like how do we implement zero trust security within our network through things like MTLS? How do we do things like different types of rollout strategies, or how do we do things like retries and timeouts? And so Cilium Service Mesh was a way to address that within the Cilium project. And there's kind of two different ways that Cilium implements that. One is with eBPF. So all the things that can be done in the kernel are handled through eBPF. And the things that can't be done within the kernel, Cilium ships with Envoy as a daemon set to be able to provide that layer 7 functionality that's needed. And kind of these like kind of concepts of the service mesh are what allows companies to implement things like zero trust security by being able to encrypt their data while in transit and at rest. And Cilium helps companies kind of like provide these different things so connecting things in a secure manner.
So that kind of brings me to this particular question. Like, can you talk about some of the technical aspects of Cilium that you find particularly interesting or innovative, such as the use of eBPF or the data plane API or the dynamic policy engine?
Yeah, so I think the thing that's probably originally was most interesting about the project was that it had an eBPF based data plane. And it began like this from the beginning, way before people even had kernels that were including eBPF. And I think that's what has really set the project apart and continues to make it a leader within the space, is that it was founded on eBPF as its core technology since the beginning, and it's not trying to kind of like bolt on the functionality later. And there's not like kind of two different ways of deploying it where you need to handle both of them. Oh, looks like we've lost our host. Let's see what happens. Hi, are you still there?
Yeah, hi, Bill. So I was wondering if you could actually walk us through, Cilium's integration with other Kubernetes native tools such as Istio or Prometheus.
Yeah. So Cilium integrates actually with a lot of other tools in the cloud native landscape. And I actually had to write up a bunch of these for our due diligence for graduation. So kind of like I'll just kind of like run through them really quickly, and if you want to dive into any more of them afterwards, I can talk about that some more. Um, so Cilium, so CNI, container networking interface, is a specification, and Cilium is a project that implements that specification to provide, the container networking within Kubernetes. So it integrates into Kubernetes as a CNI. It also integrates other Kubernetes resources like Kubernetes network policies, services, ingress, and the new Gateway API project. Cilium can be installed with Helm, which is another CNCF project, and it exposes Prometheus metrics that can be consumed, stored, and queried by Prometheus. It can also export metrics to OpenTelemetry, which is kind of like a big project in the observability space, and also export logs to FluentD. Other CNIs like KubeOBN integrate Cilium for additional functionality like network policies. And Cilium, as I said, also has Envoy as a daemon set for layer 7 and some service mesh functionalities. Cilium integrates with Istio if you want to have Istio as the control plane and Cilium as the data plane. And Cilium can also use Cert Manager for TLS termination of certificates. And as part of kind of like the growing service mesh functionality, Cilium is developing integrations with Spiffy to provide MTLS between services too.
So, how does Cilium, handle load balancing and service discovery in Kubernetes environments?
Yeah, so this is something, are you talking about kind of like north-south or east-west?
East-west.
Yeah, so Cilium is the CNI within the cluster. So it knows where kind of like all the pods are and who needs to connect to what. And that's what it's kind of like doing as the CNI, is it's providing this connectivity between the pods.
Right. So I'm also personally pretty much interested in encryption and decryption. So I would like to ask you this question: how does Cilium handle traffic encryption and decryption, and what types of encryptions are supported?
Yeah, so Cilium for transparent encryption, Cilium supports IPsec and WireGuard. So there's two different ways that people can implement encryption, and that provides node-to-node encryption for traffic within Kubernetes clusters.
Right. So I have had this question, and I think a lot of people in my network also insisted I ask you this question. How does Cilium handle network policy conflicts and ensure consistency across multiple data planes?
Yeah, so usually what's recommended is if you're implementing network policies, you should just have one data plane handle the network policies. So Cilium can run in a chain mode. So if you want to use what we've seen before, like AWS VPC CNI, and using Cilium for network policies, but you wouldn't use kind of like two different data planes for network policies, because then you can run into conflicts like that. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, can you discuss any recent or upcoming features or enhancements to Cilium that you are particularly excited about?
Yeah. So Cilium 1.13 actually just came out, and it was packed with a bunch of different features. It's almost hard to list all of them, just because I think that's one of the cool things about the project is that there is so much coming out right now. I guess some of the ones that I would probably highlight from the 1.13 release is that first, the Gateway API integration just got released. So this is a new project, kind of the replacement for Ingress within Kubernetes, and Cilium implements Gateway API, and I think it's really cool to see kind of like the evolution of that project and to have people kind of like trying and testing that out, and providing feedback to the upstream project too. So with Gateway API, it provides you with a lot of new functionalities. Um, Other things that just came out is the MTLS data path is now built into Kubernetes. We, for really large clusters that have kind of like really high performance requirements, we've now implemented big TCP. And for people that want to replace their cloud load balancers or like things like Metal Cubed, there's now IP address management as a load balancer of Kubernetes services, and a new integration with BGP. For those in the telco space, there's SCTP support. And for people that are like integrating IPv6 and IPv4 workloads, there's now NAT 4664 integration too. So lots of different, I guess, cool things in the networking space coming out.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I personally like to keep myself updated with all of that. So, how does Cilium handle the network policy and security for hybrid cloud environments that span multiple cloud providers or on-premises data centers?
Yeah, so that's a bit what I was talking about before is kind of Cilium provides this cluster mesh functionality that allows you to connect clusters across different providers or like different environments that you're running in. And the cool thing is it provides you kind of like one kind of like unified layer to kind of connect and control all of those clusters together. So it can do things like providing network policies across all of those clusters. So you can say who can talk to which service and who can't, even if they aren't running in the same cluster. It can also do things like tell you where to how which services to connect to. So things like, please, to save our costs, make sure you connect to services in the same cluster. But if those services are unreachable, please, you should fail over to another cluster. So, being able to have like backup in case like something goes wrong. And it also allows you to have like if you want to do something like an upgrade of a cluster, you can reroute the traffic to a different one, like upgrade the cluster and then bring the traffic back. So there's a lot of cool things you can do with Cilium when you're trying to connect together different clusters.
I think then it kind of becomes super convenient also in that particular regard, with this amount of functionality. So, talking about, multi-tenancy, how does Cilium support multi-tenancy and isolation in the Kubernetes environments, and what options do you think are available for different levels of granularity?
Yeah, so this is going back to a lot of the service mesh functionality within Cilium. So being able to provide like different policies about who can connect to what. So like both on like the network policy side, saying you can either reach out to the cluster or you can't. You can connect to this workload or you can't. And then also like on the service mesh side, providing MTLS between different services to make sure you can implement more like zero trust security in your network. And being able to like load balances between different services in the cluster too.
Right. And, going back to our, discussion on traffic encryption and decryption, this brings me to ask you this particular question. Uh, Please explain us how Cilium handles the traffic routing and the traffic shaping and what types of traffic management features are supported.
So Cilium provides a lot of different traffic management um, features. So it'd be hard to kind of like list them all. I would say like at a very high level, like the difference that sets Cilium apart from other project is that it's using eBPF for all of these routing decisions rather than other traditional policies or sorry, technologies like IP tables or NF tables. And what kind of allows you to do is to provide faster networking that's more performant, especially as you scale up.
So, one topic that definitely I wanted to ask you about is observability, right? So, how does Cilium handle observability and logging, and what types of metrics and tracing features are supported?
Yeah. So as I was saying before, Cilium integrates into a lot of different systems if you want to export your observability data to them. So things like Prometheus, OpenTelemetry, FluentD. But on top of that, Cilium also provides its um, own uh, project called Hubble. And what that allows you to do is to observe the flows within your network. And so you can see which traffic is going where and what is being allowed and isn't being allowed. And it provides you kind of an overview and allows you to observe your network. On top of that, Slim also integrates to Grafana. So if you have all this great observability data about what's going on within your cluster and where different network traffic is flowing or what's happened in different network traffic, integrating it into Grafana allows you to actually visualize that data. So you can see things like how often is this network policy used? What kind of responses are we getting to different types of requests? And is our traffic working as normal too?
Right. So, what do you think how Cilium ensures backward compatibility with different versions of Kubernetes and other cloud native tools? And what strategies are to manage upgrades and migrations?
Yeah, that's a very broad question. I would say like the best way to look for kind of what versions Cilium supports and integrates with would be to look at the Cilium documentation. I think it'd be difficult to list to like the whole compatibility matrix with all the projects in the cloud native landscape because there's hundreds of different ones. In terms of kind of like support for the project, so the project supports the current versions and the last two minor versions. Um, and Cilium supports the Kubernetes versions that go along with those too. Um, if you're asking about like a very specific one, I would go check out the docs because even what I say now will be kind of outdated probably unless you're watching this live right now.
Yeah, this is absolutely live, and I hope a lot of people might have questions regarding Cilium following this particular podcast as well. So, on a concluding note, I would like to ask you, since this particular show is pretty much catered towards pushing people to get into the cloud native ecosystem and contribute based on their interests and their prospects. So, I would like to ask you about an advice. Like, what advice would you give to developers or organizations who are interested in contributing to Cilium project or adopting it in their own environments?
Yeah. So for people that want to get involved in the project, I would check out the contributing guide because that provides you with a great way to kind of like get started, set up your environment, and look for like good first issues to get started with. For people that actually want, who really want to get involved in the project, I've always found that the best contributors are actually users. And if you want to kind of get started with Cilium in your own environment, there's also a bunch of different getting started guides for almost any environment that you're running on, also in the Cilium docs. So I'd recommend checking out one of those. If you don't have time to do that or like don't want to set up your own environment, Isovalent also provides a lot of labs around Cilium too, including the getting started with Cilium lab too. So it's a great way to kind of get started experimenting it and figure out if you want to like use Cilium in more of your environments. There's also one of my colleagues is working on different migration guides from different CNIs toward to Cilium too.
Right. Thank you for that advice, by the way, Bill. On an unofficial note, I would like to ask you, why Cilium as a project did you think of contributing? Or is it part of your work at Isovalent that required you to work at Cilium? Or is it something that you started contributing before joining Isovalent?
Yeah, so before joining Isovalent, I didn't make any contributions to Cilium, and my role at Isovalent is 100% focused on the Cilium open source project. So it is part of my job now.
Okay, okay. And to be very honest, if anybody looks at your profile, they can also see that you're also a committer at the eBPF project. If you'd like to give us a little brief about it, because as I promised that we would love to have a podcast with you on eBPF altogether separately on a much later date. So just a little brief about eBPF also.
Yeah, so eBPF is like a revolutionary Linux kernel technologies that allows you to like change and modify the behavior of the kernel at runtime. And this allows you to implement new functionalities in a more performant way than was previously possible. A good kind of like parallel that people like to use, it's kind of like when JavaScript came to the web browser, suddenly instead of having static web pages, you could have a lot more interactive elements. And that's what eBPF is enabling in the Linux kernel too.
Right, right. Awesome. Thank you for being with us here, Bill, and definitely giving your 27 minutes to us discussing Cilium. But on a broader perspective, I have certain, inputs to give you. Um, why did you, join the cloud native ecosystem? What is about the cloud native ecosystem that interested you, that you got into it and you started working in the particular space?
Yeah, so I would say I fell into the cloud native space by accident. My undergrad was actually in biochemistry, and then I got a master's in social science. So it's almost a complete accident I'm here. But the thing that's made me stick around is really, I think, kind of like the people and the opportunity to learn. I found that the people are very like helpful, friendly, open, and willing to share information, and that creates a really fun and dynamic environment where you can learn a lot of things. Like for example, I've actually been able to find all of my jobs within the cloud native ecosystem just through people I know or have worked at or met at various points because everyone is always kind of interacting and collaborating together. And I think that really makes like a fun environment to work in.
All right. Since you mentioned that it is because of the people that working and living in this ecosystem every single day makes it really really worth it, and also your journey into cloud native system has also been one hell of a accident, but a beautiful accident nonetheless. So since you mentioned people, I would like to ask you, what is it about the community that keeps you at your work and just inspires you more and more to contribute to the system?
Yeah, I think it's what I said before, like that people are friendly, people are helpful, and people want to see like other people in the ecosystem succeed. I know a lot of times industry can be like cutthroat, and I think it's a lot different than that in open source, where everybody wants to, or a lot of people want to see like other people be successful too. Like one example I can give you, there's another eBPF project in the ecosystem that does continuous profiling called Parka, and they actually did a live stream where they profiled Cilium, and then they actually made a PR to help improve the resource utilization of Cilium. And I think that's one of the cool interactions to see in the ecosystem.
Awesome. And what would you suggest the certain improvements that you would like in the ecosystem? Nonetheless, I definitely agree with you that the open source community and the cloud native community is awesome. It's always helpful. It's inclusive and is wanting to get more and more people into the ecosystem, because I feel that firsthand. What do you suggest? Like, people adopt so that it can make the community even more inclusive than before.
What does the community want to adopt? Um, I would say like there's a lot of simple things that people can do. So like adopting a code of conduct for your project, for your event, for other things like that, helping it make a more inclusive space, making sure that you actually use and enforce that code of conduct when you need to, and also like make sure you call out other people's behavior when it goes against kind of like what we would expect from a community experience too. So like everyone kind of doing their part to help ensure that the community continues to be a welcoming space.
Great, great. And since you mentioned that your entry into the cloud native space was more of like a coincidence, so I would like to ask you, if there is a student who is interested in getting into the cloud native space, about seeing it from outside, how inclusive the space is, what do you recommend? How do they get into the cloud native space? What are the initial steps they are supposed to take? Is there a roadmap or some resources that you can probably share with them, that they can probably filter out and then make judgments based on where in the cloud native ecosystem they would want to work in?
Yeah, so like I think the thing that's led me on my whole career has been um, making it kind of like learning from what I'm doing. And like I was saying, the best contributors to a project are the ones that are actually using it. So like the thing that I would doing is start experimenting with something. So whether that be like setting up your first Kubernetes cluster and then figuring out like which parts of it you like doing and which parts of it you don't. That's how I've kind of like led my whole career, is like playing and experimenting, and then figuring out what things I wanted to learn about more or what things I wanted to experiment with more. And that's led me kind of like the whole course of my career. So for a student that wants to get involved, I would say try like pick like three different projects, try them out, install them, see which ones you like, and then see if you can use them in your daily life. And if you can, then you can start experimenting, providing feedback to the project, maybe a contribution. And that's a good way to get started. My first contribution to the open source ecosystem was actually just a docs PR to the Kubernetes project. I fixed a broken link. So it doesn't have to be like some crazy project, but I made that PR because I was writing a blog post about Kubernetes and I was reading through the documentation to understand it, and one of the links wasn't working. So what you're practicing leads kind of like what you're going to be learning about. So I would encourage people to just like start experimenting in the ecosystem, and then as you find what you're interested in or like what you're working on, I think that'll lead the rest of the course for you.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you for being with us, speaking with us for quite some time, and thank you for introducing us to Cilium, because it means a lot to students, to people beginning out in a certain project, for a maintainer or person, official person working on a project to come and speak with them, because then it adds a lot more credibility and a lot more faith into how they can start as well. And I definitely believe the fact that the kind of journey that you shared, the little bit of story that you shared with us about how you got into the ecosystem, can also motivate the other person could to get started as well. So thank you again, Bill. We look forward to having you speaking about eBPF very soon in the same podcast. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thank you